Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
Thomas Berry, another writer in this whole area, invites us to sort of put our hand in front of us and look at our hand and say, that hand is the product of a 15 billion year process.
Today on Reflections, Father Bacik talks with Father Roland Calvert from the Dominican Mother House in Adrian, Michigan. The topic of this week's Reflections is creation spirituality, our response to the environmental crisis. And now, here is Father Bacik.
Roland, let's talk a little bit about creation spirituality. That's much in the news these days, and it's a live topic, and I'd like to deal with it in relationship to the environmental crisis that we're currently undergoing. I notice a lot of the writing in creation spirituality seems to me to be a response to the fact that we're in trouble in the environment, that we have problems of pollution and so on. So maybe that's a good starting point, make it a bit concrete.
Okay, that would help if it gets concrete. I've noticed that in the feminist movement, and creation spirituality would be connected with that the environment is very directly a part of what they're writing about. You know, they get off into the environment and the attitude we have toward that very often, and have a great deal to say about our attitude toward the world we live in.
I noticed Matthew Fox, our creation spirituality writer of note that many people know, a Dominican priest who's written the book Original Blessing, and then more recently The Coming of the Cosmic Christ, is often thought of as the leading figure in this creation spirituality movement, and much of his writing does concern the environmental matters. He's very concerned with the earth and what we're doing to the earth. He talks about Mother Earth is dying.
Yeah.
Becomes one of his favorite phrases. Sure. Mother Earth is dying, and we must do something about it. So he, it seems to me, is very influenced by those questions.
Yeah, throughout that book, The Coming of the Cosmic Christ, the word matricide shows up often. Yes. He begins the entire book talking about a retreat that he was giving at Kirkridge, I think, in Pennsylvania, and had that dream and heard the cry, your mother is dying. And it was so striking to him after, as he was thinking about, what does it mean? And didn't mean literally his own mother. And finally he began to say, I think it means the earth that we live on, that in many ways it is dying.
And that is a common symbol, Mother Earth.
Yeah.
Religious traditions have talked about it that way, and it seems like an apt metaphor because the earth gives us our life. We're a product of the earth, and that's one of the things these creation spirituality writers want us to remember, that we are a product of the long evolutionary process, that we go back to something like 15 or 20 billion years when this universe of ours started, and then our earth is 4.5 billion years old, and life appears on this earth maybe something like human life as we know it, something like 2 million years ago. So, and then we are the product of all of that. Thomas Berry, another writer in this whole area, invites us to sort of put our hand in front of us and look at our hand and say, that hand is the product of a 15 billion year process. And we are, another one of his phrases is that we are stardust made conscious of itself. So that they want us to get a sense that the earth is our mother. It has produced us, and we carry those elements within us, and we are, the evolutionary process now become conscious of itself.
Well, I think in the feminist movements that I mentioned, and creation spirituality is very feminist, as Matthew Fox presents it. It has to do with reclaiming the feminine in every person. And the patriarchy that he talks about that has dominated so much has excluded those feminine qualities and the ability to be a mother, and that every person needs to reclaim that, and particularly toward the earth we live on. It's not there just for power and exploitation, but it's there to take care of and to love.
We need to get in touch, I think, with this environmental crisis, Roland, to be able to appreciate the power of creation spirituality and its importance. One way I have of doing that is to remember the story of Chico Mendes. Chico Mendes was the head of the Rubber Tappers Union down in Brazil. and he was a Christian and formed in some of the Christian-based communities down there. Those are the small groups that gather to study the scriptures and to see their social implications. Well, Chico Mendez was very interested in saving the rainforests in his area, and the rainforests were being attacked by the cattle barons who wanted to cut them down to graze cattle, and they did that in order to be able to sell beef to, especially to our fast food chains up here in the United States. Chico Mendez understood the environmental impact of cutting down the rainforest, because that makes it harder for us to breathe clean air, and the rainforests keep alive many species, and they do all kind of things to make this earth habitable. Chico Mendez understood that, and he used to organize people to stand in front of the bulldozers to keep these cattle barons from cutting down the rainforest. Well, these people did not like that, and eventually they shot him. Married man, husband, father of two, Christian man, shot as a martyr to the environmental cause. And often he's been remembered now. You see his name mentioned in articles, and they had a major religious service in New York City remembering his death, and so he has become a figure sort of comparable to Oscar Romero for the liberation theologians. Creation theologians like to pull forward Chico Mendez as sort of a hero figure, and saying that, well, his death really now is a martyrdom, and that it opens up these questions and focuses for us this environmental crisis. In one sense, you could take his whole story and what he was about and to epitomize the environmental crises that we have.
Yeah, it is a parable that contains all those elements that Matthew Fox talks about. A patriarchal system which is most interested in making more money and has a system of values where everything else, including all the human values, are subordinated to that. And a person is simply wasted, as the saying goes, if they don't fit into the system. Matthew Fox would call all of that patriarchal, and it's just a typical example of the power, the exploitation, and the willingness to do anything to make money, which is a form of power.
And then when that is happening, of course, then part of what happens is Mother Earth is dying. In other words, it doesn't matter. There is the rape of the earth. You do whatever you want to the earth, and not thinking of the long-range consequences.
Yeah. It's so short-sighted. People are willing to take the very planet we live on and plunder it, and eventually kill the race if need be, in order for the short-term thing of power and money. And
it's a frightening situation, isn't it?
It sure is.
Wasn't it interesting, Roland, that Time magazine did not choose a person of the year this year, but in their January 2nd issue of 1989, they put Planet Earth on the cover. It's the year of the planet, and Planet Earth, and their whole thrust of their article was, of course, the great trouble that the planet is in. It's threatened by the practices of human beings. I read someplace that if all the species got together and had a roundtable conference, one of the first things they would do would be to try to expel the human species, because the human species are the one that's ruining life for all the rest of the species on Earth.
Oh, absolutely. There's a section in Fox's book, The Coming of the Cosmic Christ, where he talks about whales and points out that they have been on this planet millions of years longer than human beings have. And the whales have never organized into wars, killing their own species. They have never organized mass weapons of destruction. They have not polluted the environment and threatened the entire existence of everything. And he says, if you look at the two species and their record, you wonder which one is the really admirable one. Humans have a lot of sin that they need to repent.
If you just sort of tick off familiar names these days, you begin to sense some of this magnitude of this crisis. Love Canal.
Yes.
Love Canal gives us that whole idea of sort of burying the pollution, and then it's surfacing. That's the area where they covered over the polluted chemicals, and they built a school on there and housing and so on. And before long, all that started started seeping up out of its containers, and they found these higher incidences of birth defects and cancers and so on. So in the popular mind, Love Canal becomes a symbol of what goes wrong, of this pollution of the world. What do we do with all these chemicals? And then again, the idea that the companies were not responsible. I mean, they didn't act responsibly is what I want to say.
Sure.
They ended up just burying these things, knowing that sooner or later, no matter what the containers are, they're going to leak. And once they leak, then they get into the environment and they begin to affect the human beings.
Yeah, rather ironic name, Love Canal.
Yes.
And we just had the anniversary not long ago of 3 Mile Island and the not near, but the nuclear disaster that occurred. And as bad as that was, the technology of the plants, which was so inadequate, the human errors that occurred, a cooling system, for example, that was turned off for reasons they've never figured out by human error. But I think of all the things that happened, the most frightening was the lying that occurred afterwards, the efforts to cover up, the efforts to tell the public that nothing bad was happening, it was under control, and it wasn't under control. And still, there are hundreds of thousands of gallons of water that is polluted. They have no idea what to do with it 10 years later. And we have this blind faith in technology that's going to save us, and there's so much evidence that we're heading toward destruction with it.
We don't even know where to put the waste from these nuclear plants. I mean, there's a great debate on where to bury it and where to put it, and various states don't want it, and so on. So that begins to multiply problems. Then you throw in Chernobyl.
Yes.
So we start thinking of that, and you begin to see what the disastrous effects of that kind of accident, and we're still reaping the difficulties that created. You know, a lot of times, Roland, I think that all becomes sort of abstract, all those images are in people's mind. I've been looking at ways to try to make this concrete. I read someplace where a Soviet scientist said they would never have to do anything to hurt us because in 100 years the United States will be a desert, given our farming practices and the use of fertilizer, that our topsoil will all be gone and we won't be able to function. I read someplace that someone claimed that the state of Iowa, our richest farmland, by the year 2020 would be a desert. 2020 is not that far away. Now, that might be an exaggeration. I have no real way of knowing. I know that was in print, and I'm not exactly sure if that's true or not, but let's say that it's just partially true, or let's say by the year 2050, 1/3 of Iowa was a desert. Wouldn't that be frightening enough? Then you think of the population problem. I read someplace by the year 2030, we would have 10.2 billion people. That's twice what we've got now. By the year 2030. And we're going to be trying to feed people on planet Earth. So those are some of the ways I'm trying to get at the magnitude of this problem, because we're never going to be able to solve it unless we begin to sense its importance. Sure. Don't you notice in newspaper accounts these days or on television, you notice how many times environmental questions are raised? Of course, we have an oil spill now in Alaska. Gigantic, bigger than anything we've ever had before, and that has raised the pollution question again.
Sure. Well, it came home to me most powerfully in the early 1960s. I grew up in a little town in Maryland, ironically called Providence, and when I was growing up, I thought that was the perfect name. It was a beautiful country town, little village of about 150, and the life centered around a paper mill, which my father worked there, and most of my neighbors. And in 1948, it closed down, and in 1954, after not being used, it burned down. And, of course, by then, everybody had found jobs elsewhere. But then a chemical company bought that property. And in the early 60s, in this little country town where there was fresh air and beauty, and I guess I'm romanticizing it, but I remember it as being just like paradise almost. And they brought in the toxic waste from a lot of chemical companies in Delaware, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. The worst toxic things, they couldn't do anything with, the residues, brought them to that little town and tried to refine them further. Polluted that creek beyond belief, polluted the air. A doctor moved in and noticed how foul-smelling it was and got equipment to monitor it, and found carcinogens in the air, brought lawsuits against them. They fought that for 15 years with no change whatever. The cancer rate went up about 5 to 6 times what it should have been. My own mother died of cancer, my aunt and uncle, And it would just, the business went on, through all of that, through the funerals. That continued to operate, making money. And it was such I was so angry in those days that the willingness of people, including some Catholics, you went to the local church and there was the manager of the entire chemical plant up front reading. And my uncle used to comment on that. He spoke of the sanctuary as the Amen Corner. And he says that I won't mention his name, but he was in the Amen Corner every Sunday. But how they get together their conscience and what they're doing to people and the willingness to do it just to make money totally escapes me.
Well, that really makes it concrete, Roland, and that's what we need to do in order to sense this problem, especially when you're talking about cancers and increase of cancer and a loved one dying. That's when maybe it comes home to us more forcefully than any other way. I mean, you can talk about the greenhouse effect and ozone depletion and waste and population problems and loss of topsoil and water pollution and acid rain. Those things are all in the news, but I suppose it comes home to us when we're talking about human beings dying from this kind of activity.
Yeah,
and it really sets up, too, our responsibility as believing people to do something about it and to figure out how the Judeo-Christian tradition plays into all of this. You mentioned, that, you brought in the religious factor, and I want to expand that a little bit because there's a real problem. There was a professor, a cultural historian, I think he was, by the name of Lynn White, Jr., who wrote a famous article in 1967. It was called The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis. It appeared in Science magazine. He had given it as a talk to a group of scientists. And the claim of Lynn White, Jr., in that what has become now a classic, famous article, was that the Judeo-Christian tradition was greatly responsible for this pollution, for the ecological crisis that we were in. And for two reasons. That what he saw the Judeo-Christian tradition doing, as epitomized in the book of Genesis, that's what he looked at especially, was that it desacralized the earth or the physical world. That is, the primitive religions saw the earth inhabited by spirits and so on, and that therefore they were going to reverence it and take care of it. The American Indians would be a good example. The earth was the Great Spirit. It held the Great Spirit, and therefore, you wouldn't hurt it in any way. But so the Judeo-Christian tradition came along and trying to react against some of those primitive religions that worship nature and had fertility rites and sacred prostitution and so on. They said, no, God runs the world. This is God's creation, and you don't want to worship it in that kind of way. And the second thing they did in the Judeo-Christian tradition, book of Genesis, was build up human beings. It said human beings are made in the image and likeness of God. They are the highest, and they are given dominion over the rest of the earth. So Lynn White Jr. puts those ideas together and says, here is the root of our problem. It is right in the biblical tradition that we're to dominate, and what we've done is take that seriously in the Western world, combine it with science and technology, and we've succeeded in raping the earth, in really causing the death of Mother Earth. So now that is a telling criticism, which we might, just to complete the article, he felt that we could do better by getting back to St. Francis. St. Francis, who reverenced the earth, and could talk about the earth and the sun and the moon as being his brothers and sisters and so on, all of that kind of language, close interconnections, that represented, in Lynn White's mind, some sort of a solution to the problem.
Yeah, it's. I think there's no question that the attitude we have theologically very much determines how we're going to act toward the earth. And one of Fox's most cogent points in creation theology is that if you begin with original sin, you are making it so anthropocentric, so man-centered. And actually creation goes far beyond that, as you said, maybe 16 to 20 billion years of the universe existing. And we just came in the last couple of million years in that process. And then to construct your view of the world so that you are the center of it, and as you say, can dominate it, rape it, plunder it, do what you want, that is a theology, I would say, that is absolutely defective. And we're seeing the results of it in the plundering of the earth, or as Fox would say, the matricide. Mother Earth is dying.
I think it's worth pointing out that there are many authors who disagree with Lynn White's analysis. While it's remained a classic article to bounce off of, many have critiqued it negatively. René Dubos is one. He tried to point out that, well, other cultures that weren't influenced by Christianity also were involved in raping the earth. He talked about the deforestation in China, for example, which has been a major problem, and so on. He says, well, you didn't have Christianity there, and you had another religion and religious outlook that we commonly call Taoism and Confucianism, and even out of those religious traditions, you had, the use of poor use of the earth, and so he says you can't just say that it depends on the Bible. And the other thing is that authors' critique about Lynn White is his failure to see that there's another strain of thought within the biblical tradition that is sees human beings as stewards of the earth, not having dominion over the earth, but as stewards, and they're called upon to tend the garden and to help it to grow, and that all the way through the biblical tradition you can see that side of it. We proclaim a new heaven and a new earth, and there's a certain reverence for God's creation. So I think that it's a very tough debate here, and I wouldn't want to leave a one-sided impression here about the biblical tradition. I do agree with the critics who say that there are other resources in the biblical tradition to use to overcome our environmental problems.
And you could go beyond just the Judeo-Christian Bible. I think that within humanity itself is the potentiality for evil. I've been listening recently, to give a different example, to Wagner's Ring Cycle, because I hope to be in New York City the first week of May and see it at the Met. And on the Saturdays of April, Saturday afternoons, that entire four-opera cycle will be broadcast. And it is about original sin. It's based on Teutonic mythology. And it uses different symbols. The beginning of it is gold at the bottom of the Rhine River, and it emits light. But it's rather directly analogous to the tree of good in the Garden of Eden, of knowledge of good and evil. And Wotan, the head of the gods, and Alberic, in a patriarchal system, fight for control of that gold and that power and for domination, and are willing to rape the earth, to lie, to cheat, to do whatever they need to do to get the power. It would certainly be a musical presentation of Fox's ideas on patriarchy. And at the end of it, just to get to it's a very long, about 16 hours of music, Die Götterdämmerung ends with the destruction of the gods, the destruction of the world, and everything is plundered. It is a very somber parable about the dangers of that patriarchal kind of attitude. And it's the kind of thing I would say that we really need to listen to.
I'm reminded as you're talking here about another person who writes in this area of creation spirituality, who does draw on wider traditions, is very interested in the American Indian tradition and other mythology, sort of an expert in that, and that's Thomas Berry, who was one of my professors at Fordham, a marvelous man, a Passionist priest, and he has written a book called The Dream of the Earth. And I think Berry's main idea is that there is now an earth story that we could use to draw upon to get ourselves in tune with the environmental crisis and to figure out how to overcome it. And he says the earth story is simply that long story of the 15 billion year process that's brought us to this point, and a 4.5 billion year old earth, and this long struggle of the life forces groping to get more diverse life forms, and eventually humans appearing, and then humans being able to shape the process. So he says any person in any culture now can know that story. Educated people will come to know we are on spaceship Earth, and we have a common destiny and a common origin, and we carry the same sort of stuff in our bones and blood, and that ought to bind us together. So instead of feuding over nationality differences or feuding over particular religious differences, we get the common Earth story that begins to bind us together. Now there we get sort of a broader view of things that is trying to overcome some of our other difficulties.
One of the problems that I would see with Matthew Fox, and let me just say generally that I respond to him so positively, and it's intuitive a lot more than rational, I know that. He just speaks in a way that very deep inside me I say, yeah, I like that, and I think it's right. But one of the problems, for example, in the coming of the cosmic Christ, is to use the cosmic Christ as the great symbol that should unite all people on earth, he hopes. I would think that ecumenically that would present some problems for Buddhists, for Muslims, for non-Christians, for Jews certainly. And Thomas Berry might have a better approach, where we go to science and we look at the universe, the facts about it, and the wonder that it causes and how awe-inspiring it is, and go from that basis to our own wisdom traditions and figure out how we're going to respond to it.
That's good, and I think that's my own fundamental way of approaching this. Is I don't really end up agreeing with either Berry or Fox, but I like to put them together, and that is to say that Thomas Berry gives us this widest kind of vision, the Earth story that every human being partakes in, common origin, common destiny, and so on. Yeah. Use that, but then to say that has to be put into dialectical relationship with the particular stories, and the particular story for us is the Judeo-Christian tradition, and what we need to do is refocus that and reinterpret it, draw out of it all of the elements that will help us to tend better to our earth. Now, let's remember the Psalms. I think it's Psalm, I'm forgetting the number right now, it's Psalm 104 that speaks so well of the creation, the praise of God's creation. We have beautiful ideas about like that. We have in the book of Job a reminder that God is the master of creation, that we aren't. Do you know where we store the snow, or where the rain comes from, or where were you when we set the foundations of the earth, says God to Job, in telling all of us, no, I'm the master of creation, not you human beings. And so we've got within our New Testament, our Christian scriptures, again, we have Romans 8, that whole idea that creation will share in the victory of the sons and daughters of God. We got Jesus using these wonderful parables about nature, the birds and the flowers and so on. So that's what I would like to do, is reinterpret that, refocus it, draw on it, so that Christian people then are able to say, no, right in my religion, I've got a motivation and an energy for trying to attend to these terrible pollution problems.
Sure. One of the beautiful quotes that Fox uses from Meister Eckhart is the little statement that if the only prayer we ever say in our entire life is thank you, that would be sufficient. And if somehow we could get that attitude toward the world, that it should be enjoyed and it should be contemplated, and there should be a profound sense of gratitude welling up, and we don't ask the question, how can I use it, plunder it, exploit it? It would be a fundamental difference in mindset that would bring a lot of different results.
That's well put and a good summary, Roland. We're talking about the environmental crisis and claiming that the Judeo-Christian tradition could be refocused in order to help us to deal with it more constructively.
You've been listening to Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo. Today, Father Bacik talked to Father Roland Calvert from the Dominican Mother House in Adrian, Michigan. The topic of this week's Reflections was Creation Spirituality, a response to environmental crisis. If you have any comments on today's show or suggestions for future programs, please write Father James Bacik, Catholic Campus Ministry, 2086 Brookdale Drive, Toledo, Ohio, 43606. Funding to this program was provided by the Catholic Communications Commission of the Diocese of Toledo. Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
I find an interesting corroboration here of this fundamental teaching of Jesus, this correlation between physical health and the ability to get beyond your anger and upset with other people.
Today on Reflections, Father Bacik talks with Dr. Thomas Dunn, Professor of Educational Psychology at the University of Toledo. The topic of this week's Reflections is Love Your Enemies, Theological and Psychological Perspectives. And now, here is Father Bacik.
Well, Tom, I want to talk a little bit about the general area of religion and psychology. I presume that that's a good dialogue topic for us, since I am a theologian and a Catholic priest, and you are in the whole area of educational psychology. Why don't you tell me a little bit about your background and your outlook on educational psychology and so on?
Well, how far back you want me to go with background?
Well, I know you. We went to the same school, to Fordham.
Well, that's right. Well, I got a bachelor's degree in Fordham,
Yeah.
and after some time in that was a long time ago.
Yes.
And then some time in the Air Force, and then graduate school at Florida State. Psychology major at Fordham, educational psychology for a PhD at Florida State. Came to Toledo a long time ago, in 1971, and
Been teaching at the University of Toledo.
absolutely right.
And you and I have had interesting conversations on many topics, and one of those is the relationship of religion and psychology. And I've always interested in talking with you because I get a fresh slant. I guess I know psychology more from the viewpoint of what I often call the humanistic psychologist, and have drawn a lot on Allport and Maslow and Rogers and people like that. And you represent a little different school of thought, and which I find refreshing. And so I want to see if we can't tap that a little bit here. I guess I don't. Is it proper to characterize you as a behaviorist?
Well, people give me that name sometimes. It's a label that is somewhat misleading. I guess I'm more eclectic than that. However, I do have a lot of experiences and background, and some of my training was in behavioral psychology. And I teach courses in behavior modification at the university, so some people do put me in that
Well,
category.
and why not?
Right.
I always wanted to dialogue with a follower of B.F. Skinner and attack them vigorously. That's been one of my goals as a theologian, so I'm going to take that opportunity. No, what I'd rather look at is some similarities here, and where we can see that the teachings of the Judeo-Christian tradition seem to have some parallels in the world of psychology. And let's move to the Christian tradition and the specific teaching of Jesus of Nazareth that we are to love our enemies. There's something distinctive in that teaching. I mean, in a lot of other religions, we've got this idea of loving people and so on. But Jesus really highlighted this idea we're even supposed to love our enemies. And many of his stories really were along that line. It had to do with the interplay between the Samaritan community and the Jewish community, and where they were considered to be outsiders. And we find stories of Jesus in which the Samaritans, the hated foreigners, the outsiders, turn out to be the heroes of the story. We have a Good Samaritan parable, which would ring very strange to the ears of the listeners in Jesus' own time. And so he begins to tell us about this idea that we are to love even our enemies. He says that a lot of people can do this, love your friends, and the people you get along with, you're on the same wavelength with them, fine, you're supposed to love them, but I give you even a tougher kind of commandment, that is to love your enemies. Now, at first blush, that seems like a very odd thing to do. I mean, it would seem as though that's rather destructive behavior, that we wouldn't be looking out for our own best interests, and it wouldn't work well for us. But it appears to me as though this whole idea of love your enemies has a psychological dimension to it, that it proves to be even a healthy way to try to live. And that's what I'd like to try to get at. You want to respond any of that to that point?
Oh, very much so. And I have to say, in kind of an historical way, when I first started to teach behavior modification, and part of behavior modification procedures involve a lot of reinforcement that you look for and reinforce appropriate behavior. And I've taught a lot of counselors and a lot of teachers and parents behavior modification strategies over the years. And I was always struck by something that often would happen as a sidelight to what was going on, and that is that in a classroom, if the teacher tried to reinforce appropriate behavior and downplayed the use of punishment as the only procedure, that oftentimes the teacher was happier and the students were happier. And the same thing with parents. And so...
Now, what's an example of this, where you're reinforcing this good behavior?
Well, for example, if a teacher is particularly disturbed by some kids who are acting up, not paying attention, or even maybe fighting, or saying unkind things to the teacher, kids can do that. Yeah. That the teacher may often get angry at that, and let's face it, be perfectly honest, you cannot always feel fondly towards all the students in the classroom. You may experience a period of time of feeling animosity towards some students. And in a behavioral approach, what you're really supposed to do, and I remember when I was in graduate school, one of my professors said, you want to catch them being good. And that struck me.
Catch the students being good.
Catch them being good.
And then you compliment them for this.
That's right.
One
now,
way
you
or
can
another.
compliment them, or you can even get more formal and use token systems and more tangible reinforcers. But the idea is that you often have to change your own perspective. In other words, the interesting thing, what happens is when you use these behavioral approaches, the teacher or the parent or the counselor, but teachers and parents particularly, they have to change their behavior often more than the people they're working with. And so the teacher would then be placed in an interesting position of saying something nice and complimenting a student who yesterday may have given her a real hard time and that she may have been really angry with. And I was struck by a couple of things, what a healthy thing that was to do for the teacher, and also what a healthy thing it was to do for the student. And it often made the life in the classroom just more pleasant. I mean, it stopped a cycle, I guess, is the best way.
And you can apply this to parents as well, dealing with their offspring,
absolutely,
right?
Absolutely. And let's face it, the teenager in the home, there's often a war at home. And you talk about love thy enemies. Now, I don't want to say that parents and children and teachers and students are enemies, but there's often animosity between them. And I was struck by how that animosity can go away if you look for the good in another person. And the behavioral principles afford you the opportunity to do so. In other words, that's exactly what you were supposed to do. You were supposed to spend time looking for the good instead of just looking for the bad. And parents can get in the habit, and teachers can get into the habit of only being aware of the inappropriate behavior. And this was a system which, by its very nature, made you pay attention to the appropriate behavior, and then, even when you're angry, that you would actually go up and say, hey, I like the way you did that. That was really neat.
Mm-hmm.
And when I first talk to teachers about that, they find it very difficult. It's like, how could I do that? I mean, this kid's been driving me nuts for a week. And so I was struck by that, and it's parallel to Love Thy Enemies.
And that's a really helpful way to look at that, it seems to me. Tom, I was thinking about a recent issue of Psychology Today. It's the January-February issue 1989. And there's an article in there called The Trusting Heart by Dr. Redford Williams, an MD. And he has been studying this type A behavior, which we have often associated with increase of heart attacks. Mm-hmm. And in here, he is saying that it looks to him that a big problem with the heart attacks, or the reason it occurs, because people are involved in cynical and angry behavior, that they're walking around with these kinds of attitudes and thus endangering their health in one way or another. And so when I start looking at that, I'm saying, aha, here's another indication that this teaching of Jesus, which sounds so strange at first blush, turns out to feed in even to our physical health. Mm-hmm. In other words, the doctor is saying if you can love your enemies and get beyond the anger that people bring into your heart and the kind of cynical reactions you might make to this, that you're going to be better off physically. I find an interesting corroboration here of this fundamental teaching of Jesus, this correlation between physical health and the ability to get beyond your anger and upset with other people. Mm-hmm. I think that I find this Dr. Williams not only helpful in analyzing the problem, but has some interesting things to say about it. I suppose it fits into the category I usually think of cognitive therapy, where we're very much using our reason and our intelligence to try to help ourselves deal with the difficult emotions. And it fits in, I think, with what I hear you saying a lot about. That is that we have to find our own coping mechanisms, and very often they're sort of common sense kind of things. That's one of the good things, I think, about the tradition you represent, that a lot of times when you talk about it, people hear it and say, well, I really don't have to go to a therapist for 5 years to figure this out, but there's some very practical, concrete things that I could even just do on my own. I might just bring up one of those that seems to go together in my mind, at least. He talks about that you should monitor your angry and cynical thoughts and keep track of them, and then find your own ways to stop them almost before they get started. Maybe we could talk about that part of putting into practice this love of enemy. In other words, what I'm trying to get at, Tom, is Jesus says love your enemy, and people are hearing that. It's not only sounds weird, but it sounds impossible. And so I'm looking for ways to say, well, what does that mean in practice? And so one of the things that definitely it seems to mean in practice is that you monitor your angry thoughts, aware of them, and try to stop them before they get started.
Well, what's very interesting is that people are often unaware of those very thoughts, and they would displace what's happening. For example, in divorces, you often hear the husband and wife say, he makes me so angry, or if you've had a tough day and you're driving on the expressway and somebody cuts you off, he makes me so angry. And what really is happening, of course, is that person's not making you angry. It's your thoughts making you angry. And the really cynical, unhappy person who is angry is emitting angry thoughts for a high percentage of the day. And they often find themselves not enjoying life, and they have to be convinced somehow that they are angry and hostile, and that there are angry and hostile thoughts. And that's why they're encouraged to literally keep a diary on.
Yeah, I notice he says you ought to write it down. He gives
Yes.
examples of you were driving along and somebody cut you off, and you note this and you note your feelings about it. He wants you to later on write this all down so that you begin to see
right.
the patterns, like who makes you angry, what kind of behavior makes you angry, and what it leads to.
Yeah, the person being cut off might say things like, I have to be careful what I say here,
Yeah.
but he makes me so angry, but the only way I'm going to feel better is if I cut him off. I'm going to stop it, and it goes on and on and on. And if this is what's going on inside, well, how can you feel good? And of course, what it does to your blood pressure and your outlook towards life.
Now, I notice that what he wants to get us to do here is to stop ourselves very quickly. I often, in talking to people, suggest that they have a button in their head like that goes off that says, bad thought, get it out. It's a negative thought. Stop it right away. In other words, to try to find it, to catch the pattern, see when it's coming quickly, and then have a device that will stop it.
Right.
I know you have different approaches to all of that. What's this about the rubber band around the wrist?
Well, in the early stages of doing that, people often have what appear to be obsessive thoughts about it. And in their judgment, they have no control over it. And so one of the first steps to do is very simply, you want them to gain some control over those thoughts. And it's a procedure called thought stopping, which is somewhat popular. People don't believe it. It sounds strange, but you literally, it's a process that usually begins with the therapist who says, okay, now I want you to think about those thoughts. And the therapist may scream, stop. And then you ask, okay, what are you thinking about now? And the person says, well, I'm not thinking about anything. And you hope then through that demonstration, the person realizes that, well, that word stop had some influence, and I stopped thinking those thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
Then you transfer it to the individual, and you hope, for example, use of a rubber band, that during the day, if they find themselves thinking these thoughts, they snap the rubber band and say stop to themselves.
Mm-hmm.
You often want them to scream it, but it's not too good if you're walking down the street and yell stop.
You're really trying to heighten awareness, aren't you?
Absolutely. And of course, this goes with the process of the diary of the thoughts, too. So they actually will be cued into thinking, oh, this is where I'm highly likely to start thinking this way, and then they can start snapping.
You know, this correlates, Tom, with an interesting thing we talk about in spiritual direction these days, and that's keeping a journal. The people who are being advised in spiritual direction are often told to keep a journal so that they can keep track of their thoughts and feelings on any particular topic and how they're trying to come closer to the Lord. People doing that could easily make this part of it. Negative emotions, angry, cynical, jealous emotions that come up, so I begin to see when they happen and so on.
That's right.
You know, this doctor also suggests in his second step that confession is good for the soul. Now, the very use of the word confession is interesting there. What he really wants you to do is to talk, to admit to yourself, I suppose, first of all, that you've got these angry thoughts, but then to talk to another person about it.
Right.
And he talks about how that really can help you in many ways. He says your acknowledgement is an act of trust directed toward another person. And that seems to have beneficial effects for you. And of course, as soon as we see that word in my own Catholic tradition, we're thinking of the practice of confession.
Sure.
And the traditional idea of going to the priest as representing the church, who is given the task of giving a positive message back, of giving the words of absolution, of reminding people that Jesus Christ is a forgiving Lord for us. And so being able to say it out loud and then to hear the positive response seems to fit in with this whole psychology we're talking about.
Well, you also said the idea of the confession is a behavioral indicator. I'll use my words.
Yes.
A behavioral indicator that the individual is finally being able to trust somebody else. And that's really good. In other words, the person may have gone through the process of keeping a diary of these thoughts, and through some early attempts at stopping them, that person's being very aware of getting to the realization, oh my God, look at the amount of thoughts, and look at these ugly thoughts I'm having, and the cynicism. And so the confession is and the trust in whomever you talk to, whether it be a priest or a counselor, a therapist, is incompatible, is an act that's incompatible with the cynicism and an anger. So it's almost like embarking on the road away from it.
Oh, it's wonderful, yeah. And that list could be included to friend and confidant.
Absolutely.
That you gave with.
Yes.
And that doesn't have to be a professional person.
No,
I
it
think
doesn't.
that's,
No.
again, what seems to me to be valuable about this whole approach. It's something that anybody can do in trying to deal with their negative emotions. So we're talking about how you're going to avoid a heart attack at an early age here, and very practical suggestions. Jesus says, love your neighbor, and even love your enemies, which is a very strong command. Right. I notice that here's another one that he uses. He says, put yourself in the other person's shoes. Try to understand life from their perspective, and that this is supposed to help you, again, deal with your anger. That maybe someone's got a bad day, or they've got a headache, or they were never taught to drive better, or they're in a big hurry, or a lot of other things that could help us, again, to nip this emergent angry feeling in the bud.
Yes. Well, I think that when you say love thy enemies, that's a very, very difficult thing for people to even conceive of doing. Taking their perspective might be a way to get there slowly. If you can't, I mean, when you start talking like that, and from your perspective and as a priest, I'm sure you've had people say they don't know what you're talking about. I mean, and from my perspective, if I'm working with somebody in a therapy situation, I might not use those words, but I might say, well, look for the good. And that's really difficult. Taking the perspective of the other person seems to be a way to get to that point that's a little bit easier. In other words, you can say, you don't have to agree with this person, you don't have to like them, but try to take their perspective. Look at life from their point of view.
And you say that's a mediating stage. In other words, that might, when you start looking at it from their perspective, you're liable to start seeing some good things about what they do as well.
Yes, but or at least that very act of taking their perspective, at least for those few seconds, you're releasing the anger towards that person.
Mm-hmm.
So it's incompatible. In other words, if you're trying to take the person's perspective at that particular time, it's very difficult to be angry at them.
I see. The one behavior sort of supersedes the
That's
other
right, or
and
replaces
it, yes.
And then you're placing yourself in a position where you could learn something. You might, we call that empathy rather than sympathy, you know, taking the emotional perspective of the person.
Yes.
That you might be able to say, geez, yeah, maybe I understand why that person is that way. That doesn't mean you accept it, you know, you don't, or tolerate it.
Yeah, right.
but at least you can understand that perspective.
It takes a certain intellectual energy or human energy even to try to get into this other perspective, which again takes away some of the energy from the being angry, I take it. It's
Yes.
a displacement kind of thing here.
But very difficult to do.
Yes.
Yeah.
But a lot of other steps that he suggests, this MD that we're talking about here, he has another suggestion. He says, reason with yourself.
Mm-hmm.
This gets at that very cognitive kind of behavior, as though you can talk to yourself and get yourself to change. I mean, a lot of people would think that that's sort of far out, that you really can't do that. But I think a lot of common sense things suggest that we can, that we
Sure.
can reason with ourselves. Like maybe you would say, does not make sense to be angry at this person who has hurt me, because if I do that, I'm spiting myself. I'm hurting myself more than the other person. This other person doesn't even know I'm angry at them. Why, I'm not getting back at them at all. I'm hurting myself because I'm walking around here in a blue funk and all upset and wasting my time and energy by being angry. So quit it. Stop being angry like this.
And
I think
notice-
that's the kind of inner dialogue that
That's
you
right.
want to see, right?
And notice that the very dialogue that you were providing, an excellent example of good cognitive therapy, by the way, the very dialogue is incompatible with the dialogue that the person may have initially identified in the first step, because the dialogue may have been, I can't let that person get away with this. The only way I'll feel better is if I strike back, Well, now you're saying, why should I let this person get me upset? It's really not helping me to get upset. That's not the absolute solution, but again, those types of statements are incompatible with the others and place the person in a different point where they may be able to find another solution to that problem. And in fact, that inner dialogue and reasoning with yourself is the next step, where you literally, and sometimes in a very formal way, we have people do this, write down thoughts that can prepare yourself for angry situations which are incompatible with the ones that you've already identified in the first
you
step.
prepare ahead of time for this.
Absolutely.
Uh-huh.
Absolutely. So that
I can remember doing that when I was very attacked in a talk I was giving in another city, a very conservative group of people, and I was giving, I suppose, a rather liberal theological viewpoint on something, and the crowd got very angry, but and was very upset and attacked me rather vigorously. And I remember being prepared ahead of time for that. I mean, I knew the crowd was going to be difficult, and I prepared myself mentally, and I sort of said, there's no sense in getting angry over this, and I might as well stay calm, and I know they have a different position on this than I do, and they'll probably feel attacked emotionally, so I better just cool it and try to understand. I can remember psyching myself like that, and the attack was more vigorous than I usually get, and could have been very upsetting, but it hardly bothered me. In fact, so much so that it surprised me at how little it bothered me, even though it was a rather vigorous attack. And I think I just, without realizing it, used the technique that you're just talking about here.
Sure.
I prepared myself ahead of time, and thus it was not as big a problem.
Well, there's so many examples of how people can do that. You take typical examples where people get upset. Husband and wife are going to a party, and maybe the wife says, I don't want to go to this party because they always talk about this. I always get so angry at these things. And, of course, on the way to the party, she could be saying, I know so-and-so is going to do this, and I'm just not going to be able to take it anymore. And, of course, she has a miserable time, and she's angry. Another way of dealing with that was say, well, wait a second. There's some people I like there at the party. At least, why should I be upset? Why should I be upset for 3 or 4 hours I'm there? Well, this is what I'll do. If this happens, this is what I'll do. In other words, you give yourself some options. And there's several things going on there. You are preparing yourself for another option. That's obviously true. But the other thing is the very act of thinking those more productive thoughts replaces the others. So several things going on there.
Yeah. Here's another one that he uses, Tom. He says, learn to laugh at yourself. I'm talking here about this Dr. Redford Williams, an MD and writing in Psychology Today. He says, learn to laugh at yourself. I suppose that's a perspective-bringing thing, isn't it, also? So we don't take ourselves with some sort of ultimate seriousness, but we're able to see our own self in perspective. I often think humor does that.
Sure.
I'm just presuming that's part of what he wants us to do in that. I don't know if you're in tune with that technique.
Well, sure,
or
and
not.
at least to the point where you don't always have to be perfect, too. And it's a recognition that, hey, I'm not perfect, I can get angry sometimes, and you can have another perspective other than demanding perfection or things have to be a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
That's another problem, of course. If you set yourself up that things have to be a certain way and life doesn't meet those expectations, you get angry again.
Yes.
So being able to laugh at yourself is a way of handling those, especially from your own perspective, where you are not perfect or not everybody loves you, or then you can sort of laugh at it.
Mm-hmm. I think that's the key that you were saying there. We have to accept our own limitations and our own finitude, which gets us back to the gospel again. I mean, I keep hearing all these gospel parallels in the teaching of Jesus. I mean, we have to understand we're creatures, that we're not God, but yet that's all right because we're in the hands of God. Mm-hmm. And again, that sort of trusting, open attitude seems to be part of what Jesus' message is all about in this loving the enemy. How about this one? He says, learn to relax. And that fits in, I suppose, with a lot of the stuff we've been saying, learn to relax.
Well, absolutely. And of course, that is just one of the very many behaviors that can be incompatible, because part of anger is anxiety. You'll find that often people who have and experience severe levels of anxiety, they're experiencing lots of anger. And so part of relaxation is gaining a little bit of control of that. It's incompatible with it.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, if you're learning inner control, if you relax, it gives you an edge. There's no guarantee, but you view it as a threshold level. On a scale from 1 to 100, if you lose it when you get to 75, if you walk around at 73 all the time and somebody cuts you off on the expressway, wham!
I see.
So if you relax, it brings you down to 60. And somebody cuts you off on the expressway, it gets you up to 65, you're okay.
I suppose you could even think of it that way, couldn't you? And
Absolutely,
going
yes.
into a situation and sort of gauge yourself. I'm at about a 40 now. I ought to be able to handle this.
Well, we teach people to do that.
Really?
So, they rate their anxiety, they
Yeah.
rate their feelings, rate their pain, rate their anger.
Tom, we've been talking here about the relationship between religion and psychology, and trying to look at one particular teaching of Jesus, that we are to love our enemies, which sounds strange, and yet it seems as though the findings of modern psychology reinforce it. It suggests that Jesus was a master psychologist, that he had a great teaching for living effectively, that if we're able to forgive our enemies, then we function more effectively, more at ease with ourselves, we do better things in the world, and according to this Dr. Williams here that we've been talking about, it even will help us to live better physically and reduce the chances of heart disease and so on.
You've been listening to Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo. Today, Father Bacik talked with Dr. Thomas Dunn, professor of educational psychology at the University of Toledo. The topic of this week's Reflections was Love Your Enemies, Theological and Psychological Perspectives. If you have any comments on today's show or suggestions for future programs, please write Father James Bacik, Catholic Campus Ministry, 2086 Brookdale Drive, Toledo, Ohio, 43606. Funding for this program was provided by the Catholic Communications Commission of the Diocese of Toledo.